The sand behind his house used to be his quiet refuge, a stretch of coastline he inherited from his father, untouched, peaceful, with only the waves as witnesses to his morning walks. But everything changed the morning he stepped outside and heard music, loud, blasting, careless, and the shrieking laughter of strangers dancing barefoot on the shoreline like they owned it. At first, he thought it was tourists, or maybe a group of reckless teenagers who didn't know better, and he almost turned around to politely ask them to leave. But as he walked closer, his heart sank. There were banners, rented chairs, folding tables covered with coolers and snacks, tiki torches shoved into the sand like someone was claiming a territory. And at the center of all of it, smiling like she was the queen of the coast, stood the HOA president. The same woman who had spent months pretending his land was some kind of shared community feature, even though his deed clearly showed the property line stretching all the way to the shoreline. He approached slowly, confused, but holding on to the tiny hope that maybe this was some misunderstanding. Maybe she had accidentally crossed the line. But before he could say a word, she turned around, grinning like she had just staged a victory parade, and announced loudly to her little audience, "This is our beach now. Public use. Community recreation space. He can't stop us." The laughter that followed wasn't casual, it was taunting. His stomach twisted. There hadn't just been arrogance in her voice. There had been ownership. Like they had seized something sacred, something generational. Something his father had once told him to protect with his life, because coastal land was always the first thing people tried to steal quietly. With paperwork, loopholes, intimidation, fake rules disguised as regulation. He walked forward, steady but shaken, and when their eyes met, she looked at him like he was the trespasser, like she had already rewritten the story and was simply waiting for him to become the villain in her version of it. "You need to leave," she said, crossing her arms with that smug calmness HOA presidents love to use when they think they are immune to consequences. "This is HOA jurisdiction now. The board took a vote." He blinked, stunned. "You took a vote," he repeated slowly, "on land that doesn't belong to you?" She didn't answer, not directly, just gave a shrug designed to tell him she didn't need permission, just support. Behind her, an older couple clapped like she had made some heroic civic announcement. Kids ran through the surf with plastic cups of soda, splashing water dangerously close to the narrow dune that prevented erosion, a fragile natural barrier he spent years maintaining, planting grasses reinforcing it after storms. She was destroying it in a single afternoon party. That's when he saw the sign, his own property sign, that had been yanked out of the ground and tossed beside a cooler like trash. The metal post was bent. His pulse spiked. This wasn't trespassing, this was erasure. The moment he reached for the bent sign, she stepped in closer and lowered her voice enough so only he could hear the threat beneath her words. "You can make this easy or you can make this humiliating for yourself," she said. "This community is tired of you acting like this coast belongs to you. People want access. If you fight this, the board will declare it hostile obstruction and pursue legal action." Legal action? Against him, the owner? He wanted to laugh from disbelief, but rage anchored the sound in his chest. He inhaled slowly, gripping the sign, not to use it against her physically, but to ground himself, to stop the tremor rising in his hand. The old him would have walked away, avoided conflict, swallowed anger. But something clicked different this time. Not ego, not pride, just realization. They weren't asking. They were taking. And if he didn't push back now, they would cement this theft as community usage history and later attempt an easement claim. This was step one of a land grab, plain and simple. He pulled out his phone and started recording. The smirk on her face flickered just slightly. "I'm giving you one chance to vacate my property and remove all of your party equipment immediately," he said clearly for the camera. "This land is legally deeded private coastal frontage. You are trespassing." She exhaled loudly through her nose, glancing over her shoulder to make sure people were still watching before snapping loudly, "It's not trespassing if it's public access." The crowd behind her nodded like they had just heard gospel, not fiction. He pointed to the property marker behind the dune, the one the HOA always pretended didn't exist. The only public access is half a mile south, he said. This parcel is privately held. Your board has no jurisdiction past the fence line. She scoffed, rolled her eyes, and then, in a voice sugar-coated with fake righteousness, fired back. Then call someone. Let them tell you. Because we're not going anywhere. It would have been easier if she had shouted, if she had been dramatic or hysterical. But she wasn't. She was confident, steady, daring him. Because she thought he had no one who would help him. She thought he was outnumbered. She thought he was powerless. And even though his blood thundered in his ears, even though the anger pushed to his throat, he didn't yell. Instead, he lifted the phone slightly higher and said in a low, unshaken tone, "Okay." Then he walked away. She laughed behind him like she had won. But she didn't understand. He wasn't retreating. He was documenting. And when he got inside his house and closed the door, he didn't hesitate. He called the sheriff's office. Not the HOA board. Not mediation. Not negotiation. The law. Because if they wanted to pretend this was a legal matter, then he would make sure it actually became one. While he waited for the deputies to arrive, he glanced through his kitchen window, watching them tramp through the dune grass like they were stomping on his father's memory. He remembered planting saplings with him, learning about erosion, listening to him say, "This land is yours to keep safe, not to keep empty." There's a difference. The difference is stewardship. He hadn't fully understood those words growing up, but today they landed in his chest like a promise. The HOA wasn't just trespassing, they were desecrating. By the time the first patrol car pulled onto the gravel near his driveway, the late afternoon sun was angling across the sand, and he could still hear the music pulsing like a taunt. The deputies walked down the beach pathway toward the crowd, not aggressively, just observantly. The moment Karen saw them, she waved her arms like she had summoned them herself. "Officers, good, finally," she said, stepping toward them before he could even open his mouth. "We've got a hostile homeowner here trying to interfere with a community event. This is designated resident beach frontage. We have board approval." They looked at her calmly, then turned to him. He handed them his deed copy, laminated, prepared, filed. He had kept it ready ever since the first time the HOA threatened reviewing coastal access claims. One of the officers scanned it, then walked toward the property marker, comparing coordinates. The change in his posture was subtle but visible. He turned back toward the deputy beside him and gave the slightest nod. Karen's smile flickered. Not vanished, not yet, but cracked. "Ma'am," the officer finally said, "this isn't HOA land. The deed is valid. This party is taking place on private property without owner permission." Her face froze, just for half a second, before the arrogance surged back. "That's not correct," she said sharply, as if correcting a waiter about a menu item. "The board has registered this as community frontage." "Registered with whom?" the officer asked. No answer. Just that tightening jawline, the one you see right before a person realizes the bluff is beginning to collapse. By now, some party guests were drifting closer, whispering, uncertainty rippling through the air like wind. She tried again. "He's been hostile with the neighborhood for months. Everyone is sick of him locking people out." The word locking nearly made him laugh. "What lock? A property boundary marker?" The officers didn't fall for it. "Ma'am," the first deputy said, "you and your guests need to clear the property. If you do not comply, you may be cited for trespassing." Gasps, whispers, confusion. And then something uglier, embarrassment, because the crowd that hyped her minutes ago was now shrinking backward, not wanting to be associated with a legal violation. But she didn't move. She stepped forward, eyes blazing, voice low and venom-laced when she hissed, "You think this is over? You have no idea who you're dealing with." But he just looked back at her, not angry anymore, just certain. "You're right," he said quietly. "It isn't over." Because he already knew this wasn't the final confrontation, it was the opening shot. And before the sun set, she would prove exactly how far she was willing to go, and how deep the legal consequences might eventually drag her down. The deputies eventually dispersed the crowd, but the look she gave him as she finally pulled her party supplies off his sand was not retreat. It was calculation, cold and silent like someone moving chess pieces no one else could see. She didn't yell, didn't storm off, didn't make a dramatic exit. She just stared at him while folding up a table, her jaw tight and her eyes sharp with a promise. This wasn't over. And he could tell in that strange quietness that she was the type who didn't lose battles. She erased the record of them so it looked like they had never been fought in the first place. The next morning proved him right. He woke to find 3 HOA violation letters shoved through his mailbox, all carbon-copied with board signatures, accusing him of unauthorized obstruction of community access, maintaining hazardous shoreline barriers, and, most insulting of all, creating a hostile environment for residents. It would have been absurd if it hadn't been strategic. They were trying to build a paper trail, not against him as a landowner, but against him as a nuisance, someone interfering with communal rights. It was a classic HOA maneuver, weaponize bureaucracy until the real issue, property ownership, disappears behind invented technicalities. He didn't panic. He documented everything: photos, videos, time-stamped calls, officer reports. Weeks passed, and instead of backing off, she escalated in subtler, more insidious ways. Anonymous complaints to code enforcement about erosion hazards that she herself had caused. Co-newsletters implying the shoreline was in dispute. Whisper campaigns claiming he had been verbally aggressive to women and children. Not a single accusation said his name directly, but everyone in the development knew exactly who they were talking about. Some neighbors stopped waving at him. Some deliberately avoided walking near his property. Others whispered, "Good luck," with the kind of pity people give someone they think is already losing. One afternoon, he found a child's beach toy dumped over the property line, not by accident, but as a symbolic intrusion, small but loud in meaning. And then came the surveyor. Not his surveyor, hers. She hired a private surveying firm to remap the line, attempting to reinterpret the easement boundaries. When he stepped outside and saw a stranger holding a measuring pole on his dune, he walked straight across the yard and asked calmly, "Did you get owner permission to enter this parcel?" The man looked uncomfortable. "The HOA board issued the work order," he said. "They don't own this land," he replied. "Legally, you're trespassing." The surveyor hesitated, checked his paperwork, and left, clearly realizing the contract he'd been handed was misleading. Within hours, she was at his front step, knocking like she was collecting a debt. No pleasantries, no pretext, just war. "You're dragging this community into conflict," she said, not shouting but vibrating with indignation that someone dared oppose her. "All we're asking for is access. People deserve a beach. This neighborhood was supposed to have amenities." "This neighborhood has amenities," he said evenly. "It doesn't have coastline." She leaned forward slightly. "It will." That was when he understood. She wasn't trying to borrow his land. She believed she could transition ownership by creating a pattern of community usage and then introducing an HOA claim of historical access. A manufactured timeline, a fraud dressed as tradition. "You can bluff a lot of people," he said, "but you can't litigate your way into deeded property." She smiled, but it was thin, humorless, metallic. "That's what you think. You don't understand how boards work," and she walked away. By the end of the month, the HOA filed a formal civil complaint, not for ownership, not yet, but for injunctive relief, asking a judge to compel him to restore community, access, and remove hostile barriers. They were staging the first rung of a legal ladder that would later become an easement claim. She wasn't stupid, she was methodical. And most people lose to methodical villains because they don't see the long game until they're already bleeding from it. But what she didn't know was that he had spent every night researching, collecting statutes, past rulings, precedent cases, watching court archives and reading stories of other homeowners who had been steamrolled, people who didn't lose because they were wrong, but because they were blindsided or too exhausted or too alone. She assumed he was alone. She assumed wrong. The day of the first hearing, he didn't walk in with fear. He walked in with evidence, videos, police reports, drone footage showing the dune damage, a notarized survey, and a real land use attorney, not some cousin with a business card, not a free consultation, an actual coastal property rights specialist who had taken on HOAs before and beaten them. The hearing was supposed to be a quick formality, a judge rubber-stamping a temporary order until facts could be established. Instead, the judge watched the footage of her party and paused longer than expected. "This is not shared frontage," she said slowly, scrolling through the drone stills. "Nor is it in HOA-maintained territory." The HOA president tried to talk over her attorney, insisting the board had authority to designate community access areas if the intent of the neighborhood agreement implied shared coastline benefits. The judge turned the page. "There is no clause granting implied shoreline use," she said. "In fact, there is very explicit language excluding it." The first crack wasn't public, but procedural. The judge denied their motion and reprimanded their counsel for misrepresenting jurisdiction. That should have been enough to make her stop. Any normal person would have retreated, regrouped, accepted defeat. But she had something worse than determination. She had ego mixed with humiliation. Losing quietly was not an option. So she escalated again, not in the courtroom, but socially, politically, and psychologically. Flyers began circulating, claiming he was trying to privatize nature. Neighbors were told he planned to build a wall that would block scenic value. Someone anonymously reported his home to the county for structural hazards, triggering an inspection attempt designed to inconvenience him. She even hosted backyard community update nights, where she painted herself as a protector of family recreation and accused him of trying to take away summer from the children. It would have been laughable if it hadn't actually started to influence people. HOA politics are like smoke. They don't have to be solid to suffocate you. But every time she escalated, she forgot one truth. The louder a liar gets, the more visible their pattern becomes. And her pattern was getting sloppy. One parent came to him quietly and said, "She told everyone you threatened the deputies." Another whispered, "She said you were trying to fence the ocean." Another confessed she told people he was a legal hazard to families. Lies multiply fast when they're unchecked, but they also multiply witnesses. He wrote it all down. Every rumor, every misrepresentation. Instead of fighting her socially, he built a record legally. And then something shifted, not with paperwork, not with rumor, but with exposure. One of the teenagers who had filmed the beach party posted the video online, not out of defense, not out of loyalty, just because kids film everything. The clip showed her yelling, staking claim, tearing his sign out of the ground while saying, "It's HOA land now. Take your little ownership tantrum somewhere else." It got shared, then reposted, then commented on by strangers who didn't even live in the state. And the internet did what the internet always does with HOA tyranny. It turned a local bully into a public spectacle. Comments poured in like wildfire, people from other states saying this was exactly how they steal land. People tagging lawyers, coastal advocates, even an HOA abuse watchdog account that had a surprisingly large following. She didn't know about the video immediately, but when she did, when she realized she wasn't just fighting a homeowner but a public narrative, the rage ignited behind her eyes like gasoline. Because now she couldn't just win, she had to crush him to restore her image. And that was the moment she made the one mistake people like her always make when their pride gets cornered. She stopped trying to bend the law and started trying to break it. And that would be the step that wouldn't just cost her reputation. It might be the step that costs her freedom. When humiliation wasn't enough to stop her, she shifted into retaliation dressed as righteousness, doubling down like people do when they would rather burn everything down than admit they were wrong. And she started organizing what she called a community access walk. Not a party this time, but a staged, peaceful recreation demonstration meant to create a visual record of residents using the beach, fabricating the kind of timeline a court could later twist into a claim of historic usage rights. But because she knew she could no longer get deputies to look the other way, she planned it quietly, through side conversations and encrypted HOA group chats, trying to manufacture inevitability. If enough people wandered onto the land at once, it would look like the beach was already communal, and he would be framed as a gatekeeper instead of a landowner. Except this time, she wasn't the one doing the watching, he was. He had already installed cameras facing the dunes, preserved every digital trace of her encouragement to trespass, and when she set the date for her so-called walk, he didn't prepare to confront her. He prepared to end her. The day arrived cloudy, wind-heavy, with choppy waves slamming the shoreline like the ocean already knew a storm was coming in more ways than one. And as a small crowd began strolling casually onto his sand with towels and strollers and smiles rehearsed to look innocent, he didn't step outside, didn't yell, didn't order anyone to leave. He simply stayed inside and filmed, letting them dig their own legal grave by turning trespass into choreography. But the real trap hadn't sprung yet because she wasn't satisfied with just presence. She needed power, needed domination, needed a moment caught on camera where she could humiliate him publicly, strip him of authority in front of a crowd. And she thought she was about to get it when she walked up to his dune with a cordless drill and a brand new, freshly printed HOA sign that read, Community Beach Access, HOA Authorized Recreational Zone. She wasn't just trespassing now, she was installing false signage on private property, which turned the situation from civil overreach into criminal tampering and fraudulent representation of authority. She thought it was a flex. Legally, it was self-incrimination in real time. The moment the drill pressed into the wood of the post, he was already dialing, not the non-emergency line, not property mediation. The sheriff's office directly with footage ready to upload before the responding officers even arrived. And this time, the deputies didn't come alone, because his attorney had already filed for injunctive protection and notified them of previous trespass warnings. So the responding unit brought a supervisor, which meant the incident was being treated not as neighbor dispute, but as a repeat criminal violation under dispute of property rights. She saw the cruisers approaching, and instead of stopping, she held the sign higher like she was making a political stand. A martyr performance, muttering to the people behind her, "This is public land by use. He can't evict the entire community," not realizing she was literally narrating documented intent to appropriate private land. When the deputies stepped onto the beach, she turned with a smile already poised like she expected applause, gesturing to the crowd as if about to receive legal validation. But this wasn't the same scene as the first time. This time, they already knew. The supervisor asked, "Ma'am, is that your sign?" She proudly said yes. Then he asked, "Did you get permission from the property owner to install it?" She said louder this time, "This is authorized by the HOA board." And then the shift happened, the moment authority stops indulging delusion and starts drawing lines in law. "The HOA has no jurisdiction here," he said. "You are altering property you do not own. I need you to remove the sign immediately." Her face hardened, disbelief tightening her jaw. "No," she said. "The community won't be pushed around by one selfish homeowner." That no was the detonation, because refusal turned the act from trespass into criminal defiance of a lawful order, and when she stepped backward and touched the sign again like she was defending a territory that wasn't hers to defend, the deputy didn't argue. He called it in as property damage and unlawful installation, confirming that she was tampering with boundary designation. One of the deputies then approached him for the original deed copy and prior footage confirmations. And when they saw the first beach party video, the dune damage photos, her earlier removal of his sign, and now the drill footage in her hand, they realized this wasn't activism. It was patterned property seizure behavior, which moves the case out of petty dispute and into the realm of criminal land encroachment and fraudulent representation of authority, both of which carry felony escalation. When tied to an HOA official acting under color of authority, the crowd had gone. Silent by then, people who came expecting a symbolic victory suddenly realized they were witnessing a crime unfold. When the supervisor told her she needed to stop drilling immediately and leave the property or she could be detained pending investigation, she tried to weaponize the crowd again, snapping, "Are you really going to arrest a community representative for protecting access?" And that was the final mistake, because he stepped forward, not angry, just resolute, and said clearly for the record, She is not protecting access. She is attempting to illegally seize deeded land through fraudulent HOA claim. This is private property, and she has been warned repeatedly. That sentence was surgical, because now the deputies had verbal confirmation of knowledge and repetition, which eliminated any argument of confusion or misunderstanding. She turned red, not embarrassed red, but cornered animal red, and pushed past one of the deputies in a desperate attempt to reassert control, reaching for the sign to finish installing it before they could stop her. But that physical shove crossed the final legal threshold, interference with law enforcement while committing unlawful encroachment. The deputy didn't yell. He didn't negotiate. He simply said, "Ma'am, put the drill down. You are now being detained." The gasps behind her rippled like a shockwave through the beach. The HOA members who once cheered her suddenly stepped back, hands disappearing into pockets, faces folding inward like people trying to unwitness what they had been part of. She wasn't cuffed immediately. Detainment comes first while investigation is live. But the moment that drill hit the sand and the sign stayed half-mounted like a broken flag of arrogance, she realized, visibly, that her board vote wasn't going to save her. Her community support wasn't going to shield her, and the authority she waved like a sword was collapsing like wet paper. They escorted her up toward the driveway while collecting statements. He provided copies of all evidence, the HOA notices, the false filings, the attempt to resurvey his land, the code enforcement harassment, the flyers implying a fake public claim, and the footage from both trespass events. The supervisor's tone shifted from neutral to formal, because now this wasn't just property violation. This was abuse of office, harassment using structural authority, and attempted land appropriation by deception. She tried one last tactic, framing herself as a victim of hostile anti-community retaliation. But the body cam footage already had her on record threatening him, instructing others to trespass, overseeing damage to protected dune grass, and attempting to alter the land boundary sign. The deputies told her she would be referred to the county attorney for review of criminal charges, including potential fraudulent claim of jurisdiction, which in many states qualifies for jail time when tied to misuse of HOA authority. She panicked then, not loudly, but in that brittle silence that comes when a person realizes the courtroom they were trying to drag someone else into may now be where they stand as the defendant. The board called an emergency closed meeting within 24 hours, not to defend her, to distance themselves. HOA loyalty evaporates fast when accountability arrives, and when her own board realized she had acted without formal authorization in writing, they prepared to remove her as president to protect themselves from liability, leaving her isolated, no votes, no shield, no manufactured consensus to hide behind. But the consequences didn't stop at removal, because once the video that had gone viral crossed paths with the footage of her second unauthorized access attempt, a legal advocacy channel picked up the story and submitted it directly to a property rights nonprofit that actively monitors HOA abuse cases. Suddenly, it wasn't just a neighbor dispute. It was evidence in a national pattern of HOA overreach, which meant more eyes, more scrutiny, more legal traction than she had ever imagined. He didn't have to destroy her. She destroyed herself by refusing to believe that a boundary line she couldn't emotionally accept was still, legally, a boundary line. And the most ironic part? The prison risk wasn't coming from trespass itself. It was coming from something far uglier, using a position of authority to knowingly attempt unlawful seizure of real property, which is the kind of phrasing prosecutors don't call conflict. They call it attempted land theft under color of office. She had tried to steal coastline with paperwork and manipulation. Now the paperwork and documentation would define her downfall. In the weeks that followed, the investigation expanded, from her actions on his land to her handling of board funds, her past votes taken without minutes, and her pattern of intimidation toward non-compliant homeowners. People who once stayed silent started coming forward,